All right, welcome everybody to this very special Jorge Manrubia live stream. First of all, Jorge, welcome to the live stream.
Thanks, Jason. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you here. This is the first thing that I've done like this ever. I'm hoping that I'll do this kind of thing regularly. I've been hosting a what I call the Code with Jason meetup for some months now. That's been going really well. But that's mostly been just me doing a presentation, and then we talk about some technical topic, or I talk with somebody, they bring an issue they've been dealing with, and we kind of chat about that. But something I'm hoping to do more is to bring in somebody from the Ruby community who's well known, and we do something similar to what I do on the podcast, where we have a technical conversation, but it's not just the two of us. It's something that's kind of more interactive. So anyway, this is hopefully the first of many of those. But before we go further, Jorge, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Jorge Manrubia. I'm a programmer from Spain. I live in Valencia, and I work for 37signals as a lead programmer. Well, I'm in the security infrastructure and performance team at 37signals. So until now, I've been doing mostly infrastructure projects. Now I'm starting to work on a new product, which I'm quite excited about. But I've done like all sorts of projects in the 3+ years I've been working here. And recently, last year, I started to write a series of articles, which I called Code I Like, which is now in the 37signals dev blog at dev.37signals.com. You can find the series there. And one of those articles was Vanilla Rails is Plenty, which is like the first article that kicked off our relationship, Jason, right? For our first podcast we did together. And I guess, that's what we are going to talk about today, right? So
Yeah. So for background for everybody else, Jorge and I have done 2 podcast episodes together so far. The first one was kind of prompted by that post, Vanilla Rails is Plenty. And then Jorge and I did a second podcast episode, which was kind of similar, although we touched on some overlapping topics as well as some new topics too. We don't have a super firm agenda or list of things to touch on or anything like that today. I find that when Jorge and I talk, we're able to just kind of go with the flow. So that's kind of my thought for today. And again, I'm hoping that this can be interactive. So anytime anybody has a thought, feel free to type it there in the chat and we can address it. Maybe the first question I'll ask you, Jorge, is if you can just kind of give us a feel for the main idea behind that post, Vanilla Rails is Plenty.
Sure. So that post was a reaction to something I see in our community, in the Rails community, about how a lot of folks defend the idea that Rails is like is good for starting like prototypes or small applications that you want to get working quickly, but that at some point you need to get more serious about the architecture of your application, and you need additional constructs to what Rails and Ruby already offer. So my post was a kind of a reaction to that, based on my experience, well, in general, but my experience at 37signals in particular. 37signals, they have like 20 years of building Rails applications, and they really are heavily invested on vanilla Rails. I mean, they don't do like additional things that you won't find in Rails when you check the framework. So they've been doing this like for 20 years. They've created like several businesses. Like Basecamp is the best known business. They have Hey, which is another very successful business. But in the past, they had like Basecamp 1 and 2 that were separated products. They had High-Rise, which is Syrian, which was super famous back in the day, and it's still like a super profitable business for them. So they have like this history of creating very successful applications using these principles that I'm sharing in this post. So there's like a mismatch between what a lot of folks believe and the reality I'm seeing. And I wanted to make a case on about how vanilla Rails was enough for creating large applications in Rails.
Yeah, and Jorge, I can kind of share my perception of how this came about, and you can tell me to what extent it matches your perception. So my experience on a lot of Rails projects is that a certain thing happens over time. So in the very beginning of the Rails project, things are great. You can build features really quickly, especially your CRUD features early on. You can generate a scaffold and maybe add a few lines of code for some associations and stuff like that, and then you're good. And it's easy to keep everything clean because there's really not a lot of code to keep clean. Both that's true, and it's true that early on when there's not a lot of code, you can afford for your code not to be as good because it's not that easy to get confused because there's just not that much stuff. But then as the app grows, you get a bunch of code accumulating in the controllers, but even more so the models. People follow the heuristic of skinny controllers, fat models, which I think is a good heuristic, but people follow that and they end up with this accumulation in the models. And so if you have, say, 12 database tables, you have exactly 12 files in your app models folder. And these models grow to be hundreds of lines long. And you have these slots where you can put things, controllers, models, helpers, whatever. And people perceive these slots as kind of filling up, especially the model slot. And they think, oh, these slots have filled up. I need some new slots. And so they invent these things like service objects. And they say, okay, now I have this new kind of construct. And this is how I can organize my code now. I found the solution. So that's kind of how I think we got here. I think that's kind of the problem that people are looking for a solution to. So having said that, I just want to pause and Jorge, is that kind of your idea, or is that kind of your perception too, that that's the problem that people are looking to solve?
Yeah, definitely. That's the problem people are looking to solve. A problem that I will sum up as like building like large applications is very hard. Like software is hard. It's incredibly hard to create a design that solves some needs, that is maintainable, where things that is easy to read, is easy to to change. So that's like the essence of what software development is after, and it's very hard. And you're right, like it's very easy to create. I mean, I would say that whatever approach, framework, or libraries you're using, it's very easy to create a mess unless you really have like tons of experience and the right mindset, practices, skills. It's super hard. And yes, so there is like this this is a recurrent theme I've seen, which is that, okay, so vanilla Rails, that approach of using Rails is going to degenerate into a mess that can't be maintained. So what you need is an additional bucket and additional constraints. Two examples. One is services, the one you mentioned. So you say, okay, controllers, if you think of controllers as the endpoint of your system, controllers can talk to models. You need like an additional application level entity, such as service or an interactor, who are going to orchestrate what the endpoint does. So that's one example. Another example is to say, okay, business logic can't be coupled with persistence concerns. So you can have like models like accessing the database directly. You need additional abstractions to access the database, and you need to keep your models clean. And then you have like the repositories or the data access objects. You came from Java world. They were like super common my time. And so you create these additional artifacts. And what I see over and over is that it's like it gives you a sense that you're solving a problem, but in my mind, you still have like a super complex problem to solve, which is software development. And those abstractions you have added, first of all, they come with a tax to pay, because whenever you add more abstractions, more code, more indirection, you are like making things more complex, and you are, getting some benefits, but also some trade-offs or some price you have to pay. And the other thing is that, when you look at, in my experience, in my opinion, because all this is subjective, okay? Let's make that clear. Like I'm talking out of pure opinion. So, in my opinion, when you look at those systems, at that code, it's not better in terms of the quality of the design, like most of the cases, or in many cases. So yeah, that's a common theme I'm seeing. Like, let's create new buckets, and those are going to be to solve all issues. But you still have like you still have like, I think that the core issues you already had, and a new set of problems. And when you follow with, when you go with those, with that approach to software design, like without not knowing what you're doing, it can be really, really harmful. It can be really, really harmful. So for example, if you say, okay, I have a problem with my controllers, and my controllers are huge. My controller actions are huge. So now I'm going to get all those lines of code, and I'm going to place them in a service. So my controller is now going to be a one-line controller invoking a service, but the service is the same mess. So you really haven't tackled like any kind of core problem. And
yeah, I totally agree. And if I may,
yeah.
I want to add a comment about the idea of meaning, which I think is really important. So first of all, I totally agree with what you said, Jorge. If you have a messy controller, and if you move the code from the controller into a service, you haven't really fixed anything. You've just moved the mess from one place to another. And what's lacking in a lot of applications is meaning. And in order to illustrate it, I think maybe it would be helpful to talk about what is a model. And again, that's subjective, but I can share my conception of what a model is. Because I think a lot of developers, including myself, when I first started Rails, I thought of a model as the thing that talks to the database. The controller code is what catches it's what deals with the HTTP lifecycle and stuff like that. And then you have the separation of concerns, so that you have the controller and the model talking to each other, and the model is what touches the database. And there's kind of this really, really tight conceptual coupling with the models in the database. And a lot of Rails apps have a one-to-one relationship between the models and the database. Like I said earlier, if there's 12 database tables, you might have 12 models. But then later, my conception of a model changed, because the idea of a model doesn't just exist in Rails, of course. You can have models in any kind of program. And a database isn't a necessary part of the picture when you're talking about models. And in fact, the idea of a model is not unique to programming. You can have a model of just about anything. An example that I've used before is like scientists use models to describe things, because a model isn't meant to be an accurate description or a complete description. A model is meant to be a useful approximation to the truth. So for example, think about an atom. When we see diagrams of atoms in a textbook, it's like the nucleus and then the electrons and protons orbiting the nucleus. But that's actually not really what an atom looks like. The parts of an atom are so small that like the electrons would be like it's like not an accurate picture of what an atom looks like. Again, it's a useful approximation to the truth. And there's all kinds of things like this that we want to deal with these things in a useful way. But if we were to bring all the details into the picture, and if we tried to create a faithful and accurate picture of that thing, we could never do our job, because all those details would get in the way of what we're trying to work with. So to bring that back to a model in programming, a model is a useful approximation to the truth. And I think models are most useful when they have meaning, because then you can understand what they are. I think the idea of a model is closely related to the idea of an abstraction. So when I think of models in my applications, they don't necessarily have to have anything to do with a database table. They might, and that's convenient to have that ability, but it's not a necessary part of the picture. And so my apps tend to be structured mostly in models. I don't use services or anything like that. I express most of my code in the form of models.
Yeah.
I forget my main point after having said all that, but I think that's maybe
No, but
hopefully helpful background.
I totally agree. I mean, what you're saying, I mean, I'm a big believer, and 37 Signals is super heavy in domain-driven design, in the sense that the core of an application is domain model, the models you are describing, and so you need, as a human, this also is aligned with what object orientation is about. Like, as a human, when you are reasoning about a system, object orientation, an object-oriented representation or your domain model, where you have entities and the entities are interchange messages and they compose with each other. That's just a mechanism for you as a human to reason about a complex system. Okay, so that's something that the object-oriented paradigm is designed to solve, and the domain-driven design premise is that it's very important, like to set like a common foundation, a common vocabulary about the domain problem you are solving, so that you capture that formally in a model. Okay, so I'm totally aligned with that, and I think like most people in the industry is aligned with that. But there are some schools that take, that make different interpretation of what that is about. And I'm totally aligned with you in the sense that when I'm thinking of my application, what I want to see is a set of models with clear names, well-structured, offering clear messages, operating at the right level of abstraction, so that I can rely on them, so that as a human, when I read the code, it makes sense to me. And I don't distinguish that much. I mean, we definitely, at 37 Signals, we have a ton of models that are like active record backed, and a ton of models that are pure poros, like plain old Ruby objects, like regular Ruby classes, without no persistence concerns at all. So, and for example, regarding services, for me, services as a mechanism to capture a domain operation, for me, that's a model. Sometimes you have like domain operations that don't belong to a domain entity, that there is no class or no message, no entity in your domain where it makes sense to send it a message to solve some operation. So that operation has an entity, and it makes sense to create a regular class for it to capture that. So for example, in Hey at Basecamp, I work on an email changing service, so that support could change emails on behalf of users on certain circumstances. And I created like an email change class that you could execute, and it would take care of the domain operation of changing an email. And that's a regular, for me, I mean, we don't have like a services folder. We don't have like, we don't give them like any kind of special consideration, but those service classes are perfectly valid to me, and you're going to have them in any application, and you're going to have like entities that get persisted, regular classes that are supporting operation or representing domain concepts. I don't find like a clear distinction, as you said, Jason, like super valuable, as long as what you are seeing is a domain model you can reason about. So
yeah, and I think a certain distinction might be helpful. It's distinction between a pattern and a paradigm. So I want to be clear that I'm not anti-service object. That's not exactly it. Even though I rant about service objects in my blog posts and on my podcast, it's not exactly that I'm against service objects. I'm against the idea of using service objects as a catch-all, as like people discover the idea of service objects and they say, okay, here's how we're going to write all our code now. I think that's kind of a mistake. So
and also sorry, if I can add something there, I think that a problem with the perception, I mean, I think that vision of using service objects systematically to handle like all your application endpoints is pathological. It's not helpful. It causes more harm than good. But also, I understand why, why that's appealing, or what that makes sense to some people. It's because I think if you create abstractions, so for example, imagine that you say, okay, we can't have like domain models talking to the database directly. We need like these repositories that are going to take care of the persistence concerns. So now you have like your your original domain entities and the repositories to orchestrate. And if you say, okay, controllers can talk directly to models, you need these action concepts that are going to encapsulate how, the whole interaction from the controllers with your domain model are going to be encapsulated in this interaction or service or whatever you want to call it. So now you are adding, because you want to isolate every part of the system so much, because you want to prevent different layers from talking to each other, in a maybe too strong way. You need these additional abstractions, and you need indirection, and you need to coordinate all of that. So a service makes sense, because now you can't. So imagine you can say, okay, I want to access the invoice, and I'm going to invoke the total method that is going to, calculate the total, fetching the line items from the database and summing them up, or triggering a query or whatever. Now you have like, 3 different entities, and a service, and the invoice service, total calculator, and you need to orchestrate all of that, because you are not moving, I think, in the realm of object orientation. You are moving more in the realm of procedural code, if you want, and you are losing like a lot of encapsulation possibilities, and you are also, but sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to circle back to something from before, the distinction between a pattern and a paradigm. So a paradigm is something like object-oriented programming, functional programming, procedural programming, and it tends to be the case that an entire code base is written in one single paradigm. But patterns, of course, are solutions to specific problems. And I think a lot of people, when they use service objects, they haven't really made a distinction between, they haven't consciously named it. Am I using this as a pattern or as a paradigm? I think most of the time service objects are used, they're used as if they're a paradigm. Again, they find service objects and they decide this is how we're going to write code now. But I think that's a confusion, because service objects aren't a paradigm. But there is a pattern called the command pattern. And I think that's kind of what you were talking about earlier, Jorge. It's a pattern that I've used. And sometimes that makes sense to create an object that represents an action, and that's a command pattern. So just to tie all that back, it's not that I'm against service objects. I'm against, and I should really say command pattern. It's not that I'm against the command pattern. What makes me unhappy is when people find service objects and unconsciously treat it as a paradigm, and they do so not as a conscious choice to structure their code that way after having evaluated all the possible options, but they just grab that idea because it's currently fashionable, without having good reasons for doing so.
Yeah, and circling back to what I totally agree with that, Jason. And going back to what I said, to the first example I put, if you create a service object, by default, you haven't solved at all the original problem of having, a system solving the business need. You just have like an additional abstraction. I mean, you still want the rich domain model satisfying needs, whether you access those needs via service objects or directly. You still you need the rich domain model, and this is something that DDD is very clear about, and I think it's something that it's some way lost along the way when you say, okay, no, Rails, it's impossible to do DDD with Rails as it stands. You need service objects, and you really, to me, it's very naive to think that you are closer to the finish line, just by doing that. And it's something I see over and over. It's like, okay, it's you have service objects, you have a new object to manage, but you still want the domain model supporting everything. And also,
again, you need meaning.
Yeah, you need meaning, exactly. And a well-known article by Martin Fowler, which talks about anemic domain models, which is from a lot of years ago. It's exactly because of that. Because if you enter into this everything is a service mindset, odds are that you are going to end up with a very thick application layer and a very thin domain layer. And you don't want that. You don't want a thin domain layer, whether you want a very strict application layer or not. You really want a rich, powerful, fully featured domain layer.
Can we make a distinction between application layer and domain layer? What exactly do those mean?
Well, application layer, if you think that, if you look as an application, like as a black box that you are observed as the outside, when you start hitting endpoints in the application, I'd say that the artifacts that handled those interactions are at the application level. And to satisfy those interactions, they are going to rely on the domain layer to solve needs. So application level elements to me are controllers, services, interactors. You're just following like the most well-known architectures or architectural paradigms. Those three will be like application level elements. So in vanilla Rails, the application level artifact you have is controllers. Controllers are the artifact you will manage, and you can add services too if you want to the mix.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's kind of the way that I think of it too. Like the domain layer is, again, the meaning of the business rules, or however you want to express it. And then the application layer is kind of the incidental mechanics of how everything has to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a good description for sure. And yeah, DDD, I mean, in DDD, the application layer, sorry, in the original DDD book, the application layer has like a very strong importance. And it talks about the difference between application level services and domain level services. They make a distinction between two, which is subtle, but important in the book. But in practice, what I've seen is that, of course, you can still, I mean, I'm not implying that by using like this systematic approach of creating services for everything, you're going to be in trouble, or you're not going to have like a proper rich domain model. But I think it's very important that you are aware of risks, because normally these architectural approaches that are very heavy on adding additional buckets and ceremony for creating applications, in many cases they are presented to people with not that much experience, so that you have to do things following like an architectural approach without fully understanding why. So if you are going to find yourself like, okay, they've told me I always have to create a service, and now from this service I'm going to access to I need to add a repository for add this model, and now I'm going to create to fetch this model. But if you're a junior programmer, you're going to have a lot of trouble creating what really matters there, which is the domain model design that is going to ultimately satisfy that need. And you will have additional problems also, like the problem with, for example, in the case of persistence, if you fully separate your domain objects from persistence concerns, in practice, it's very common that you find scenarios where that distinction is not that easy. So just following with the invoice example, what about, imagine that you are running a cloud service and your invoice has like 50 or 60,000 line items, right? How can you bring all those in memory and be completely separated from the database, or do you need like a specialized SQL query to sum them quickly, or do you need to paginate them in a controlled way? If models have access to persistence concerns, that's very easy to solve. But if not, you have like additional complexity because you have more abstractions, more indirection, more things to coordinate, more dependencies to inject. So what in principle is like a better approach for everyone comes with trade-offs, as everything in software development. And I think it's good to be aware of that.
So here's a question for you, Jorge. Sometimes when I talk about how service objects aren't really a solution to the problem, people say something to me like, okay, Jason, well, if service objects aren't the answer, what is? And it's it's a very reasonable question to ask, but it's not really an answerable question as far as I can figure, because like my answer is like, well, instead of service objects, I just use objects.
Right.
And that's the real answer, but it's not really a helpful answer. Because really the answer to what do you do instead of service objects is just like the entire body of object-oriented programming. And it's like that can't really be conveyed in a single answer. But I just wanted to raise that question with you, because I spend a lot of time being kind of negative and saying, here's why service objects are bad, but I want to at least spend some time saying, okay, we've said what's bad, but now let's say what's good. In addition to what you shouldn't do, here's what you should do. So maybe we can try to talk about that a bit.
Sure. And I think that the question, that's $1 million question, but the thing is that there is no a single answer. I think that something that we all want, like recipes about how to do things. But the thing is that for that question, the answer is like 50 years of books and discussions and schools of how to create software, and your own experience that you can distill like your own experience in a single answer. The way I try to answer that question, like if you are not going to use, well, first of all, my answer is whether you are going to use service objects or not, you still need to solve like the difficult part of the equation, which is how does the system under the service object look? So creating a service object won't answer that. You still need that system. And what I try to do, and I try to insist when I'm talking to other people, is like when you need to solve that need, it's very important to put yourself exactly in the part of the system where you are trying to solve that need, and try to look below that under that level, as an observer, so that forget about the details. You just need to change an email in Hey. You need to change an email. So I'm in the controller. How do I want this code to look? I think that's super important. Forget about all the mess that you have or the complex object that you have below. How do you, as a human who is writing code maybe in English, like most people do, how do you want that English code to read? I think that's a great starting point, because that will give you like, if you try to make that code pleasant for you as an observer at that point, and then you go to the other side and start building that system and say, okay, I'm going to create this new change email object, and I'm going to invoke perform on that. Okay, I'm going to the perform method. How is this going to look? And you try to do the same exercise again. So now I'm one level of abstraction lower. What can I do to make this change that I need at the business level? So, but that's essentially what software building is about. So there is no like single answer. But what I'm certain is that no matter how discrete set of artifacts you use, so if you say, okay, we're going to use services, interactors, and I don't know, repositories, we have all these artifacts. In my opinion, you haven't solved anything like yet. You still need to answer like, how is the domain model going to look like? And there is where the quality of the design of the system resides. That's my, a conviction I have.
We have a question here in the chat. I'll
Sure.
read it aloud here. Do you sometimes have some methods and models that do too many things or talk to too many other models? And there's a code example here. There's a class called invoice. It has a method called register, and inside that method, it performs a lot of validations and checks, compute payment statuses, generate PDFs, update company onboarding step for sales, update outstanding balance, do tons of other things. All right, so that's the code example. And then the question at the end is, what are your strategies to handle such cases where you feel a method is doing way too much? I see lots of applications that create services for this and just put everything in the service and write a lot of specs.
Right. I mean, yeah, if you find yourself with, in my experience, if you find yourself with a method that seems to be doing too much, it's a smell that you probably need to decompose the problem into smaller pieces. And if it's too, I mean, that can be as simple as extracting methods out, but more often where there is something that is not quite, that doesn't feel quite right, means that you need additional entities to solve the problem, to solve the problems that you're having. So I don't know if I can put an example with this code, with this pseudocode.
Well, I can maybe give an example, Jorge.
Sure.
So this reminds me of something I wrote about in a post of mine about the concept of abstraction. So something that I would comment on with this code example is that it seems to be at too low of a level of abstraction, and we're dealing with very fine-grained, low-level ideas here. Like, okay, I don't know exactly what it might mean to register an invoice, but that's a relatively high-level idea of registering an invoice. And then with respect to the high levelness of registering an invoice, performing validations and computing payment statuses, those are much finer grained ideas. And they're maybe kind of peripheral also. And so what I would be inclined to do is to add a layer of abstraction so that I can better understand the big picture of what's happening when I register an invoice without having to be distracted by these low-level details. And the example I was going to use, which is the same example that I used in my abstraction post, is if I go to McDonald's and order a hamburger, I just say, I would like a quarter pounder with no pickles, please. And I don't specify all the individual details of take the bun and put the lettuce on it, take the beef patty and then heat up the beef patty or whatever. Those are way too many low-level details. And so this invoice class is kind of like the hamburger. And in it, it's like, we should say something akin to make me a quarter pounder with no pickles. And then there's something else that can deal with the low-level details of the bun and the patty and all that stuff. It's too much detail to do all this stuff right here. So that would be my initial thought there.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point, Jason. I in this example, like I was trying to think if you for example, how I would think of the problem of registering an invoice, being that a very complex operation. I would try to use that mindset of observing the problem from the outside. What kind of imagine that you are offering like an API to register invoices. How from the outside, what's the resource you're exposing? So that will probably be you are creating an invoice registration maybe. So you are to that controller to implement the invoice registration, and what do you want the system to offer to you? So maybe you are not registering an invoice. Seems to be like a core domain operation in your application, right? It's not just a matter of creating an invoice. It seems to be like there are payment processing needs or report generation needs. So maybe you are in front of a legit domain service. Like you want to create this, invoice registration object that you want to perform or execute, like a command object, as you said, Jason. So that will be like perfectly fine way of doing that. And maybe that object, that plain Ruby object, is going to rely on additional objects taking care of report generation and all of these things. So the question from Alexander is perfectly valid. Like maybe you are like finding like an invoice model is doing something that, you know, it touches like a lot of things in the system, and maybe it's not, you know, its responsibility. Maybe you are missing like a core domain service. And I think that's a pretty legit case for using services, which is quite different to the pathological cases we were discussing before. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks, Alex, for that question.
Thank you. Yeah.
And if anybody else has questions, obviously feel free to share there. Let's see. Anything else that comes to the top of your mind right now, Jorge?
Yes, I wanted to make a point about what I said about objective and subjective reflections. Like, I think that a lot of the things we discuss are subjective here in nature. We are like talking out of pure beliefs. I think it's I don't want to offer the impression that I dismiss like other architectural approaches as invalid at all. That's not my point at all. I actually know a lot of teams where I think the most important team in a in a team of developers is that they all are aligned. And if they have like the skills and experience and they are aligned with the approach, I think that whatever approach can work perfectly fine. Okay. What bothers me about these discussions is that they are often being dismissive towards the alternatives. So that really triggers me, like, and I think it can cause like a lot of harm in the industry for people with little experience. So while these opinions are very subjective, there is like an objective thing, which is that I can vote for my employer that they are using this approach and they are building very successful business, running very large applications. People often say the joke about, oh, so why did they build Basecamp 1, 2, and 3? They had to start from scratch because their apps are not maintainable. And the motivation for each of those rewrites was not maintainability. It was like they wanted to use a different technological foundation and using maybe different internal patterns, like this delegate type pattern that 37signals released was one of the reasons why they moved from Basecamp 2 to Basecamp 3. But now we have like a more clear example, which is that Basecamp 4 has been launched on a code base from 2014 that started in 2014, so it's kind of old. And they are like, you know, releasing new features every few weeks. And so objectively, this approach I'm describing works and I also believe that there are other approaches that work for other companies. And I know that other companies are very successful using radically different approaches. But really, the only thing that bothers me is that in these discussions, sometimes you get this dismissiveness component of other approaches, and they are always used in these introductory texts, like, oh, until now you were using, you know, accessing models from controllers result in unmaintainable applications. Like assertions like that, I think that cause more harm than good. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's something I wanted to say, but I forgot what it was. Oh yeah, I remember now. So to kind of go back to this broader idea we were talking about, which is like, if service objects aren't the answer, what is? And we're trying to kind of answer in however much time we have the summation of the last 50 years of programming, which obviously we can only say a little bit. But one thing I want to say is this. So I'm working on a book right now called Growing Large Rails Applications. I've written like one paragraph of it so far, so to what extent I'm really working on it is debatable, but it's also kind of an amalgamation of everything I've written over the last several years on Rails. But what I intend to put near the beginning of the book is something about this. So as you're working on a system, it's impossible to predict what's going to change later, and it's impossible to predict what kinds of things you're going to need to add later. And in order to maintain good design, well, however you define good design, in order to maintain good design over the long run, you need to do periodic broad scale refactoring. For example, sometimes you have an entity that you pick a name for early on, but then later, okay, here's an example. Let's say you have an application that deals with phones. Then later on, the business expands and you no longer deal with phones, but different kinds of devices. And so it's no longer accurate to call these things phones because sometimes it's a laptop. And so you need to rename it from phone to device. But a lot of times, these kinds of changes are prohibitively risky. And so what's needed is good test coverage, because these kind of large-scale refactorings are impossible without good test coverage. And it sounds hyperbolic to say, but I would make the claim that it's impossible to have good code without tests. And a lot of people would say, like, a lot of people would like recoil and really react negatively to me saying that, but I think it's really true, even though it sounds really like it sounds over the top to say it's impossible to have good code without tests. It's really true, because if you follow the logic, you have to do these large scale refactorings in order to maintain good design, and you have to have tests in order to do those broad scale refactorings. There's just no way around it. So even though that doesn't give you any answers about specific ways to organize your code, I think that's a helpful realization to make, that a prerequisite to having good design at all is having good test coverage. So if you want to know where to start and you don't have that part yet, then that's exactly the place to start, because it's a prerequisite to everything else.
Yeah, I agree that, I mean, tests are, the importance of tests are out of the question at this point. They are essentials in any application that we want to create, that we want to maintain. I wouldn't know how to create a Rails application, a serious Rails application without tests, with a large code base, and keep it running in the future. How do you even think of changing it? That wouldn't make any sense. And yeah, I agree with that. Tests are absolutely essential. I recently wrote a piece, like, I'm not a big fan of TDD, but I think that will be like a subject for another podcast or session. But I'm a big fan of tests for sure. Yeah,
that might be an interesting one for you and I to talk about, Jorge. Obviously not right now, because that's a really big topic.
it is.
Because I think you and I have discovered, Jorge, that we strongly agree on quite a lot of things. But this TDD versus not TDD, I wouldn't exactly say that I don't agree with you, because that's not really even the right framing, maybe. But I do practice TDD most of the time, and I would recommend it to others. And so that could be an interesting back and forth. But yeah, perhaps another time.
Yeah, wonderful. I would love that.
Yeah. Okay. So we're at roughly an hour. I don't want to keep Jorge too long. But let's kind of open it up for Q&A at this point. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask us? Anything they'd like to discuss in maybe this last 10 minutes or so? And whenever I ask that, nobody comes forth and asks anything right away. So I was going to say we'll give people a minute, but we do have our first question here. How would you start testing an MVP Rails app that has a fair bit of features? Spike, do you mean a Rails app that was already built without tests? We have existing code now and we want to add tests to that existing code. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, Jorge, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would try, I mean, if you find like a moderately complex application without tests, which is not an ideal situation, I would think of start testing it from the outside till the inside. I think that the first batch of things you want to build are very high-level system or integration tests that exercise the app as a black box, and then try to do that and identify like the major subsystems inside its architecture, and try to do the same. Like, let's see if we can go to test to build high integration tests to those subsystems. But I think it wouldn't be as effective. And there's a book which is Testing Legacy Apps by Michael Feathers, I think. It is really good, and it talks a lot about these topics. But when you find yourself in that situation, aiming for starting like building low-level unit tests is not super effective, because they won't give you like a level of confidence of that the application is working as you intend, and give you confidence to modify it. I think it's better to start from the outside in. Yeah.
Something I would add is that as part of this question is the skill level of the team. There's this quote, "Things are the way they are because they got that way." This MVP is fairly complex MVP that doesn't have any tests. There's a reason why it doesn't have any tests. And the reason probably is not that the developers who wrote it were normally in the habit of writing tests for everything and they have those skills, but just in this case, they chose not to. It's usually not the case. When I work with an application that doesn't have tests, usually the reason is that the people who built it don't believe in testing, or they want to, but they don't know how yet, that kind of thing. And so that's a question that kind of has to come first, is like, how do we take this team of developers who doesn't know how to write tests and get them to start writing tests? And that's really not easy, because now you're doing two jobs. You're learning how to write tests, and you also have to backfill this application with tests. And I'll say that adding tests to an existing application is a distinct skill from writing tests for new code. It's even really hard for me, with all my test experience, to go into an existing application and to add tests. It's hard to decide where to add tests. Often, because of the way the code was written, it's almost impossible to write tests, or at least very difficult to write tests. And so the code has to be refactored before you can write tests, but you're afraid to refactor it because it doesn't have tests yet. So all that's really, really hard. And again, on top of that, you have to teach the developers how to write tests. So that's another part to think about. And I couldn't really give a good answer to how to approach that project without knowing that part of the picture. So my point there is, my main takeaway is set your expectations. I hate to say it, but set your expectations really, really low and expect it to take a really, really long time and be very expensive. And for that reason, I think it's really not a good idea. People believe it's smart to build an MVP with no tests. And then if the business is successful, then you go back and clean things up. The cleanup tends to not happen. So my advice is don't do that. Before I go into any of these other questions, Jorge, did you want to share any other thoughts?
No, I think that between my answer and yours, I wouldn't know what to add. I think I like your answer, Jason. Yeah.
Okay. Question from Drew Bragg here. When you're trying to move an old Rails app back onto the nice one, back onto the Rails, is there a good approach to moving service objects back to a more Rails approach? By that, I mean, is there a good scene to look for to make the refactor feel more straightforward? Jorge, what do you think?
So I'd say that if it's an application that is creating service objects for every endpoint in the application is a service object, I guess you will have to go on a case-by-case basis, seeing what the service object does, because in the general case, that service object should be like invoking some domain element to solve some need. So in most cases, I would imagine that the service objects are very thin and they are invoking like something in the domain. So you could ponder whether you can move that body directly to the controller that is invoking the service and getting rid of the service. That's one possibility. If the service objects are not, they are like they really are orchestrating like a bunch of different things. Maybe they are legit. Maybe there is a case for them, and maybe they are solving a business need. So in that case, I would say they are fine. And I would also use the, probably if you have built, I mean, maybe there is a wonderful and rich domain model like under that service layer. That's perfectly possible. If that's the case, I'd say it will be easy to remove like a bunch of the service objects and remove a lot of code and probably tests and complexity. But if that's not the case, if you have like a very thin domain model and a very thick domain service layer, it's probably a pretty complex problem to solve that implies rebuilding like a lot of how the application is built.
Yeah, to me, there's like two parts to that. It's there's two jobs. One is like conceiving of what you want instead. And then there's the mechanical job of transforming the existing thing into that thing you want. And I think that first part is the harder of the two, the deciding what you want. And again, that goes back to like, how do you summarize that? It's like an impossible thing to convey in just a couple sentences, because it's that whole thing that we've been talking about the last 50 years of programming, whatever. Another question here, taking into account that there are both patterns and paradigms, how do event message bus and view components fit into that and vanilla Rails? What do you think about that one, Jorge?
So regarding event and message bus, I think I would treat that, I mean, if you're going to integrate with a service bus, at some point you will have like some code for subscribing to the bus and processing messages. I would imagine whatever technology you use, and I would treat those points like as I would treat like a job, an application job code or a controller code. Those are like that. Those are elements that are at the boundaries of the system. So from those boundaries, you want to see and exercise a rich domain model, like solving those needs. So if you need to process a certain message that you are subscribed to, you would say, okay, I got this message with this information. How do I process it with my domain model? And I would use like the same approach that I would use from a controller. I want to see like clear names. I want to see, I don't know, rich associations. I want to see like clear domain-driven verbs for actions. I would treat those that code as I would treat like any application job code or controller code. Or yeah, essentially a friend of me, Jeffrey Hardy, which is a principal programmer at 37signals that has been at 37signals from forever. He puts me an example, which is even when I'm observing the system from a Rails console, I want to see the same things. I want high-level domain-driven names, clarity. So regarding the message bus thing, that will be my answer. And regarding the view components, the thing is that I don't really have much experience. I guess you're talking about the library by GitHub, which is an alternative to traditional templating in Rails. Do you have experience with those, Jason?
I do. I actually did a whole video on view component some time ago. I don't feel qualified to answer the exact question because I have zero experience with event message bus stuff. So I can talk all about view component, but not really how it relates to the question.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking just, I assumed that those two were not separated. It was like event message bus was one thing, view components was all the thing. I guess view components are at the presentation layer, which is above. We are talking from the controller down. This is like presentation up. So I would imagine an approach with view components would play well with this vanilla Rails approach we are describing, right?
Oh, I see. Okay, so Noah clarified that his question was treating the two independently. So
Okay.
I can maybe say kind of concisely, for me, the problem that view component solves is that there are a lot of good places to put certain kinds of code in a Rails app, controller code, model code, etc. But one thing I haven't found a great place for historically is complex view-related code. Doesn't sit comfortably in the template file itself, doesn't sit comfortably always in a helper or in a model. It's tough to find a good home for that kind of code, in my opinion. So the problem that view component solves for me is it gives a home to that kind of code so it can be neat and tidy. And I don't know how much that speaks to the original question, Noah, but that's how I view component in general. Okay, great. Well, that gets us current with the questions. Yeah, I want to say just a couple quick last things, and then we can call it a day. So first of all, Jorge, thanks so much for doing this. This is really great. I hope people got a lot out of this. So yeah, thank you very much for doing it.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Jason. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for joining us. If anyone wants to reach out, you can send me an email to jorge@hey.com, and I'm super happy always to discuss about these things. I really enjoy it and learn a lot from the different opinions that people have. So please do if you feel like it. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for coming. I want to let people know, I mentioned the Code with Jason meetup at the beginning of this recording. That's something that I do every Thursday evening. Right now it happens at 9 p.m. Eastern time every Thursday evening. As of this recording, I'm about to add a second time zone too. A lot of people ask me, 9 p.m. Eastern time, that's like 3 a.m. my time or whatever. So soon I'm going to be adding a Europe friendly, Africa friendly, that part of the world friendly time slot. 9 a.m. Eastern time on Sundays is what that's going to be. That's like 2 p.m. GMT or something like that. If you go to codewithjason.com, there's a pretty prominent link that just says meetup. You can go there, put in your email. That's how you can sign up with the Code with Jason meetup. So if you want to participate in stuff like this in the future, you can do that. And again, I'm hoping to have guests like Jorge in these meetups so we can do stuff like this. And I record these and I put them all on YouTube. If you just search for Jason Sweat on YouTube, you should be able to find those pretty easily. I think I saw one question in the chat real quick. Where can I find this recording since I joined late? Oh yeah, just search YouTube for Jason Sweat. You should be able to find it. Okay, thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Jorge. Talk to you guys later.
Thank you. Bye.